Motherboard Installation Part 2. In this nugget, we continue our previous discussion of motherboard installation, and again, that doesn't include just the motherboard, it also includes other components, and there's really no bullets under this. We're just continuing the motherboard installation. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first thing we'll be working on installing, various kinds of expansion cards. So then, first of all, here I've simply got a case. Now this is the cover that comes off, and you can see that there are screws there. It's kind of hard to see from here, but they are thumb screws, so I can take those thumb screws off, totally remove that side cover, and then access the case. This is probably the most common design that you'll see right now, and this one is completely empty. It's never been used before. On this one also, we do have another case cover over here. I could take these thumb screws off and access the opposite side of it. Sometimes you need to do that to access both sides of the drive cages if those drive cages are not removable. And then you can install your drive screws on both left and right sides. Here, of course, is where the power supply goes in, and there are several screw holes for this, 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And usually there are also tabs up along the case along the top, and also some rails closer down to the bottom here to help support that power supply when you insert it. Normally, the ATX style power supplies are going to be standardized for ATX style cases. In fact, they will be, so that you always should have an exact fit. This is our I/O shield here, and of course you can see this is where we have our keyboard and mouse right through here, USB ports, network, parallel serial, and the like, sound card, gain port. All of those things go into this cutout for this I/O shield. Sometimes a case will come with more than one I/O shield to account for variances in motherboard design, and many motherboards also, when you buy them new, will come with their own I/O shield so you can make sure that you got everything lined up just right. For example, even though I'm going to put an ATX style motherboard in here, some motherboards from ATX styles have the sound card ports here lined up horizontally, and some of them have them vertically. So it might go this way or it might go this way, and you're not always exactly sure which way they're going to go. We also have here ventilation for a fan. There's going to often be a fan right here that will be powered that you can connect to the motherboard itself. Usually there's plenty of locations there on new motherboards. And it'll power itself, and then it'll exhaust air out of the case along with a fan that appears in this semicircular region of the power supply opening as well. And then here's where our expansion cards go. With this particular one, this is kind of a cheap case, but it's very standard. That's why I bought it, because it was very standard. Oh, okay, I'll be honest. I bought it because it was very cheap. But what with this one you do is you have to knock these out. So I take the end of a screwdriver or something, and I kind of tap these out, and there's just little small metal attachments that hold these in, and then once they're out, I usually keep a few of them on hand in case I need to close up any holes. And by the way, that brings up another thing I should point out. If you have, let's say, a card that you don't need anymore, maybe you don't need a modem anymore. I mean, after all, who uses modems now, right? Some people do, but if I take a modem out that used to be in the slot and it leaves just an empty hole there, always put a slot cover back in place. Why is that? Because you do need certain ventilation. That's why I've got these holes here and this here for the fan and the like. But if you open up too much ventilation, especially if you got 2 or 3 or 4 of these open, then it's not going to create enough of a vacuum, and it's going to reduce the airspeed for the airflow going through the computer. It's going to actually get hotter because it's got too much air openings. Likewise, some people used to think that if you just take the cover off, it's going to run cooler as well. Not true, because the air does not move through it then, and it becomes stagnant, and then you get heat islands inside of the case where the hottest components will heat up, and there's no way to move that hot air out of there anymore. Now, since I mentioned installing the power supply first, let me go back to the power supply here. And here I've taken off both sides of the cover just so I can get a little bit better light in here. I also put a blue light in here, a flash unit in here, so I could illuminate the inside so you can see a little bit more clearly here that there are rails right here that the power supply will rest on top of, and then there may again be tabs up at the top. And so here's a power supply just partially installed. I got 2 screws installed here, and I left the other 2 open just so that you could see kind of what it looks like and where the screws would go if I were to complete this installation. And of course, I would snug those screws down. Also, be careful, because if you're working with this or you're working with this customer's computer, your hand might accidentally brush against this switch right here, which would potentially turn off the power supply. Even if it's properly plugged in and everything, it's not going to get any power, so you don't want to accidentally flip off your customers. I didn't mean that the way it sounded. Maybe you do want to, but in any case, that wouldn't be good customer service. So make sure that this is flipped on instead of flipped off. And the universal symbol for on will be the line right here, and off would be the circle. So this unit is currently flipped on. Then here, of course, is a picture of a motherboard. This particular kind of thing, sometimes people say to install the memory first and then the processor and then to drop the whole thing into the case. I usually install them second, but there's not necessarily a hard and fast rule for doing it one way or the other. But I usually put the motherboard in first without anything attached to it. And then once you install the motherboard here, there's usually about 9 screw holes that you can work with. There's one here, one here, one here, for example. And so if you look up and down, there's 9 screw holes in the ATX style motherboards, and they correspond to locations inside of the case. And here I've kind of side-lit this one so you can see, but we would take the ports, and here's the I.O. shield, which we can kind of see it at an angle, and we'd slit the motherboard in here. Sometimes you have to tilt it down at an angle to make sure that it goes in, and then you'll line up the I.O. ports with this I.O. shield, and of course your expansion cards would go here. This particular case is a little bit different because we don't have additional standoffs that we have to use. Those are brass little things that screw into holes on the floor of the case. This one has them built in. You can see they kind of pop up here, so we don't have to install any standoffs here. They're built into the case. But the reason why we want the standoffs is to put a little bit of air underneath the motherboard for circulation purposes. And then as you put the motherboard in here, you're going to get a little bit of spring tension from the I.O. shield. There are little metallic prongs that stick out and press against the I.O. ports on the motherboard. So you need to take a little pressure and apply it back this direction, and then take a screw, a motherboard screw, line it up with a hole, and insert it. And I usually do on the diagonals first. And I don't tighten them all the way down initially. I just get a couple of these on the diagonal going first, and then once I've got everything lined up and I'm confident that I've got these lined up properly and nothing's been messed up, then I will keep holding it tight against the I.O. shield and fully tighten down one of these, and while still holding it tight, tighten down the other one, and then that's usually enough to hold it in place properly, and then I'll snug down all the rest of the screw holes. And then I was talking about lining up the I.O. ports with the I.O. shield. Here are some I.O. ports, and this is a magnified view of it so you can see these prongs a little bit better. This is the I.O. shield, and these prongs stick out to provide spring tension against the I.O. That's why you have to push a little bit hard against this as you're working with it. And then here we've magnified even a little bit closer so we can see where this tension applies against, in this case, the parallel port of this motherboard's I.O. ports. And as I mentioned, some systems you'll have to have a brass standoff. This is what customers that I opened up their case while I was getting ready to start recording here, so I decided to go ahead and take a picture of it. It looks like somebody's dropped something on this one, but that's the standoff, and it's an enlarged view, of course, and that gives that space between the bottom of the motherboard case and the bottom of the motherboard itself. But again, I didn't need them in my case. And then here is a fan. We saw the back side of this earlier where we got kind of the honeycomb screen on the back of the case. Here's a fan that simply attaches to it. They can go a couple of different ways. They can use screws from the outside that screw in here. They're large threads that go in. In this case, this one uses rubber kind of grommets that hold it in place instead, which I actually like better because there's less vibration and it's dampened a little bit by this rubber device. This one also has a specialty kind of fan in it that you can adjust the speed. There's a switch on it. It's not very clear here, but there's a switch so you can go high, medium, and low for the speed of the fan, so you kind of balance out your tolerance for noise with your tolerance for heat. And then here's an enlargement of how that fan would connect. This particular one is for a CPU fan connector only because it's close to the CPU, which is behind it right over here. But you could actually plug any kind of a fan into this. And it's a 3-pronged fan, and it's keyed in such a way that this connector slips right over it. Most fans are pretty well standardized with this kind of a design. And then for memory, you simply take your memory module and you put it inside of these slots with firm, even pressure. You can see that it's keyed, so it only goes in one way. And as you put it in there with firm, even pressure, these locks on the side, or these levers, should flip up and clamp right into place into corresponding notches on the side of that memory module. And I do that because I don't know if you can see this here, but there's a little bit of white section of this same lever down at the bottom. When you plunge that memory down into the socket, it hits down on that and forces this up, and so it goes that direction. And so here's an example of memory installed and uninstalled that we see right here. If I were to further look at this, then here would be memory that is partially installed. It's not installed all the way because you can see these levers are still down. We can see that it is keyed in this case because there's a key over here that it'll correspond to, and there's a magnified view of how the notch goes into the key once I fully depress this and plunge it down into that memory socket. Now let me point something out here, by the way. Let me go back a little bit. As you put even pressure on both sides of this memory module to push it down in, it's kind of strange because, make sure that you're exactly lined up, that you got your notching and your keying exactly right, and all your contacts are lined up exactly where they need to be, and then push down firmly. These slots are often very, very tight, and you just feel like, man, if I push down any further, I'm just going to snap this thing in half, and it makes you a little nervous. But just make sure that you're pushing straight down with even pressure, and that you're all lined up, and you should be okay. And then installing your expansion cards is going to be much like installing the memory that we addressed just a moment ago, where you'll just put it inside of the slot, make sure the keying is lined up properly, and you're putting PCI cards and PCI slots and the voltage matches and things like this. And we talked about things like the keying and the voltage in a previous nugget. But then apply firm, even pressure downwards. Of course, you'll have removed one of these blanks here, so if this is an empty slot here that I want to install in, I'll unscrew this, take the blank out, and then install the card. Similar things apply to AGP slots, where again, of course, you'll have a little tab that locks into place on the front of the card at this end of the card, and then here's a PCI Express card right here. Now for this one, you have to pull the tab out of the way manually while you're pushing it down. This one does not automatically move out of the way an AGP one does. All right, then we also need to know how to install multimedia devices, and this is certainly a multimedia device here. This is a pretty high-end sound card from Creative Labs. It even includes a remote control, and you can get digital sound out of this thing. We'll talk more about digital sound and these various connections for SPDIF and all that kind of thing a little bit later on in another nugget. However, this card is just a PCI card, and it installs the way any other PCI card would, so there's not that much to it. Out of the back of this, you'll still have microphone in, and you'll also have line in, line out, and a MIDI device connector right here as well. And then you'll have these front connectors for this as well. And this goes into an available external drive base so that you can operate this from the front of the computer. At least that's what you would do in a standard ATX style case. The only other thing to keep in mind for this device and for our current topic, without getting too much into all these different kinds of connectors, for which we save for another nugget, is that if you already have integrated sound or embedded sound into the motherboard, you may need to go into the BIOS and disable that embedded sound in order for this to work properly and reliably. Now, one thing you should be aware of when it comes to installing additional expansion cards is that for the most part, especially on consumer level PCs, they're not going to be hot pluggable. That means that I can't, with the power on, just take the cover off and insert a PCI card right in the slot. That could cause some pretty big problems. So we have to have the power turned off when we install those. Now, one of the things we'll talk about here also is installing a device or adapter card, as well as the software and or drivers that are included with it. Let me just give you one quick thing here, and it's not really an elaborate thing, that's why I don't put a whiteboard up, but you might want to check the documentation before you install whatever that device is, whether it's a printer as a peripheral, or whether it's a internal modem that's going to be a PCI modem, or anything like that, sound card, whatever it is, and check to see whether the manufacturer recommends that you install the drivers first. And the reason for that is because Windows might detect that device and install its own drivers, and it might give you basic functionality, but it might not maximize the potential of whatever that device is. So if you install the drivers from the CD, which is usually what's included with the device, install the drivers from the CD first before you even put it inside of the computer, then when you plug in that device or insert that device and power it up, then what happens is it's going to detect those drivers that you just installed from the CD instead, which will be able to unlock or reveal all the various features and functionality of that device. And although this is certainly true for expansion cards that you can plug in, it's even more true for port devices such as USB port devices like printers or IEEE 1394 devices or FireWire devices. And as an example of a device that was installed first without installing the drivers first, let's go ahead and take a look at my right click on my computer. And so to get to manage, I'm going to go ahead and choose Device Manager. And we're going to take a look at this probably in more detail when we get into our operating system section of A+ exam objectives. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and address this because it's our current topic in terms of installing devices. And if you look at this, you see that I have a PCI Simple Communications Controller. What have I done here? Gives me a yellow question mark and an exclamation point on there. This is simply a modem that I've installed without installing the drivers first. Now, let me point something out here. I'm not saying that you always have to install the drivers first. Many of the devices I've got installed right now, I just plugged them in and Windows detected them and installed the proper driver. Many of the rest of them, however, do not have the drivers included with Windows. You see there's a file called driver.cab that it's about 50 megabytes worth of driver files that Windows already includes right after you install Windows. It's already included there, and it can install drivers for a whole slew of different devices. But this one was not available at the time that driver.cab file came out when Windows was released. So what I need to do now, since I've already made the mistake of putting it in without installing the drivers first, is I can do a couple things. I'm just going to double click on this, and it's going to bring this up for me, and it'll say I can reinstall the driver. If I have the CD for this device, I can click reinstall the driver, and then I can search for the software automatically or from a specific location, and then I can identify exactly where it's located, and then, or I can, if I know the exact location, I'll just choose this item, and then I'll click next, finish until it's done installing the driver. Now, in this particular case, I do have a downloaded copy of the drivers necessary for that particular device, so I'm going to go over here where I've got the driver downloaded. I think it's there. Anyway, there it is. There's a driver that I've downloaded. I'm going to just click OK here, and we see that it's going to put it into a directory for me. So I'm going to pause here for a moment while it extracts all those files. And then I'm going to go to the location that I saw just a moment ago, which is the USR for US Robotics modem, and it's the model 5670 modem. Here's the XP and Windows 2000 driver files for this. And then all I would do in this case is I could just run this setup file that we see here. And then for this device, I could also go back to its property sheet here to install that driver. Now, it says reinstall driver here. Even though there are no drivers installed, I can reinstall the driver. It's kind of a conflicting information there, but I could click on that, or I could go to the driver tab and click update driver, both of which would launch the exact same wizard, actually. And that would be this one you see right here, the hardware update wizard, where I'm going to install from a list or a specific location. And I'll click on next. And then I'll include a specific search location, which is on my C drive. So I'll go to my computer, C, USR, and look what happens with the OK button here. I click OK, click the USR button here, or directory, and I can't OK. I click here, still can't OK. What's going on with that? Click here. Oh, wait a minute. Now the OK button appears. Why is it that is happening? Because it's really looking for INF files. As I go through each one of those directories, if it doesn't see an INF file, then it won't allow the driver to be installed, because drivers have to be installed with an INF file, which is an information file identifying details about that driver. Here's the INF file. We don't see the extension on it because I'm not showing those, but that's the file that it's actually seeing in this directory that tells it that it's able to install a driver from that location. So now I'll just OK this, and then now I'm going to click on Next and allow it to continue its work. Now there may be times when you'll see here a warning stating that certain drivers are not signed, and it gives you kind of a, the sky is falling statement about that. In this case, these drivers are signed, so I don't receive that message, and then I'll just able to click on Finish, and now my modem, which is also a fax modem, by the way, installs properly, and I don't get my strange, yellow symbols here anymore. What is the deal with signed drivers? Signed drivers are drivers that are submitted to Microsoft and then tested by a third party to confirm that they're compatible with the current Windows operating system and don't create any known problems. Once that takes place, Microsoft affixes or assigns a digital signature to those drivers. And then if somebody changes those drivers in any way, the digital signature will become mismatched, and that way you can know if someone's messed with the drivers and whether they're different from the ones that Microsoft originally tested. Normally, 9 times out of 10, you get an error message saying that these drivers are not tested. Do you want to proceed, yes or no? But most of the time, you just have to click yes because you need the device, so you don't have much choice in the matter. But again, in this case, we didn't see that warning because these are signed drivers. And now that this device has been installed, look what happens. I can double click on this, and now look, I get some additional tabs here. First of all, it now notices that it is a modem, so it gives me a modem option here. I can adjust the speaker volume, for example, or I can wait for a dial tone before dialing. You always clear this in certain foreign countries besides the United States, because some countries don't use a dial tone. And so if you had to wait for a dial tone before dialing, in some countries, it would never happen. You might also want to test this fax modem, and in order to do that, the diagnostics page is the best place to go. Just click on Query Modem, and if it can give you any communication here, then it was successful. It doesn't have to support every kind of command. It just has to give you something back here. Okay, I see a lot of different data. That pretty much tells me the information that I need, and I can also use this online with technical support if I have a very detailed problem that I need to help diagnose. And then getting back to our driver issues over here on our driver tab, it could be that when I install this driver, it totally messed something up. Maybe it had an unexpected result. You can always roll back the driver with Windows XP or later. Now what this does is it takes me back to the previous version of the driver. If I didn't have a previous version, then I could also just click uninstall and go back to the same state that I was in before. And then if I need to adjust the resources of a device, I can do so from the Resources tab. Now, this is no longer on the A+ exam. The old A+ exam, resources were important. You had to know, what interrupt request the serial port 1 was using and serial port 2 was using and the like. So that's pretty much taken for granted now, apparently, that people know what resources are. But in brief, the memory range that we see here is a portion in memory between 640 and 1 megabyte that this device is assigned for all of its functions. The I/O range simply identifies this device to the operating system in a very specific range, and so this is a unique location for only this device. And then the interrupt request, or IRQ, is how this device interrupts whatever else is going on to tell the processor that it needs attention. Now, in current versions of Windows, really starting with Windows 2000 and with current PCI technology, we no longer really have interrupt request problems, because it used to be that we'd only have a limited number of interrupt requests, 16 to be exact. Nowadays, look at this, IRQ 53. This is because of IRQ steering and some other technology advances with PCI that no longer limit us with that. And because everything pretty much self-assigns itself, there's really not even anything I can do to change this. It used to be in the old days, you could clear the checkbox that said use automatic settings, and then you could change different settings and adjust the interrupt request to something else if you wanted to. I haven't had a device that even allows me to do that in a few years at least. So most devices nowadays we don't really have that same kind of problem with anymore. And while I'm here, by the way, you might have seen this red X, and that looks kind of alarming, so what's that about? That's just a disabled device. If I don't disable it here, then it shows up down the system tray. It's a little distracting. I just disable it because I don't have anything plugged into it, and I'm not using it, so there was no sense in having it annoy us for any reasons. And so I've shown you here how to add an adapter card, including the driver. I've also shown you how to configure it, for example, if you need to change the resources that it used, although we can't do that too much anymore. You may also have third-party software that's included with that device that might have a software interface that adjusts that item, especially the case, for example, if you have multimedia cards like sound cards, high-end sound cards, where you can make various adjustments to which channel of audio in your 5.1 5-to-1 audio system is getting more sound than the other, and adjusting bass and all those kinds of things. That can be done through specialized software with the adapter card. Then when it comes to removing the device, if I don't need it anymore, for example, this modem, what would I do? That's pretty easy with plug and play. I just power down the computer and unplug it, and then I remove that device from the PCI slot that I installed it to in the first place, replace my blank expansion card blank in there and screw it in so I don't have inappropriate airflow, and that's it. Next time I boot up the computer, the device just isn't there. There's nothing really special that I have to do. One thing, and I guess I will show you this, one thing I do want to show you, however, as a matter of troubleshooting with that, is sometimes you'll still, I guess better go to the right place here, sometimes you will still run into an issue with the driver. Maybe the driver that I installed here is giving me a problem. Well, remember, we can go to our driver tab, and I can roll back that driver to a previous version of the driver. So if I did have a previous version, and it actually seemed to work better than the new one, I can roll it back. Or if I don't seem to have good luck with this device at all, I can just uninstall it and then OK it. Then once I've done that, I can also go back to this location here, right-click on the name of the computer and scan for hardware changes. Then it will reinstall any drivers that it sees on the computer or in the CD. This is sometimes useful if I've had a corruption in one of my drivers that's on the hard drive. So I put the CD from the original manufacturer back in, and then uninstall it, and then scan for hardware changes to reinstall it. It'll pull them off of the CD, and then it'll refresh those drivers and replace the corrupt ones with good ones. And everything I've shown you here pretty much applies to just about any kind of a device that uses plug and play in Windows. That includes display devices. I can change the drivers there or change the resources. Input devices, even my keyboard and mouse, you see they also appear here in Device Manager. I can also adjust those devices here, add, remove, and configure them. Adapter cards of various types, and basic input and multimedia devices. You can all manage all of those things through Device Manager in a similar way to what I just showed you with the modem. And then in terms of preventive maintenance, you can go to the vendor's website and download updated drivers or firmware. Some devices also have firmware on them with their own CMOS settings that you can download and update, again, usually by using the internet. Firmware updates, much like BIOS updates, are going to require probably some kind of a program or an executable that you download from the vendor, which then communicates with that device, that adapter, and then updates it to the most recent version of the firmware. And if I have a driver update, then you've already seen here how to install the driver. Very simple. If I have to update the driver, I simply use the Update Driver button in the device properties. Then here's when we're going to go ahead and put in the processor. This is an older AMD socket for AMD processors. One key thing to look for here, there will be something similar to this for all Intel and AMD processors, and that is that there's a certain keying so that you cannot install the processor, backwards or sideways or something like that. And that is this corner notching right here. You see that? How that's keyed here? On the corresponding processor, you're going to see that there's also those kind of corners been knocked out. And here it is. You see how the corners go at an angle on this? That means that this processor can only be inserted one way. This particular kind of processor uses a pin grid array, so there are short pins that are sticking out here. Other types use flat contacts, and they use a slightly different kind of a connector there. But the pin type use this sort of thing, and they simply drop it in there. So make sure you flip this lever up. There's a little catch for it right here. Flip it all the way up, and then once you properly orient the processor on top of this socket, gravity alone should drop it in. You shouldn't need to twist or force it or apply really any pressure at all. If it's not falling in, double check your alignment to make sure you're right. One thing, if you buy this motherboard new and you try to install the processor wrong, what's going to happen is there are going to be telltale pin marks because of downward pressure that might be applied right here where there shouldn't have been a pin. So if I take this corner of the processor and I try to apply it right here, it's going to leave a pin mark right there, and that's how a lot of times companies will reject a return because they say, well, you tried to install the processor wrong, so we're not going to support you anymore. So here's an example of me partially putting down the plunger here, the lever. It's already been dropped in properly. Now all I have to do is to continue to put downward pressure on that lever, and then there will be some pressure that you have to apply, and it locks it into place. And then here's what it will look like once it's fully depressed here, and you can see that there's a tab there that locks the lever into place. On top of this, then, I would place the heat sink, which will dissipate heat from this processor. And this is an old scratch processor, really, that I just used for demonstration purposes. You can see that there's kind of a gooey stuff around the outside edges. That's because before I install the heat sink, you can either use something called thermal tape or thermal paste. And what that does is it puts a firm seal between the processor and the heat sink so that it's able to dissipate heat up through that thermal paste or tape and into the heat sink, and so that heat dissipates properly. What you don't want is air in here or bubbles or anything like that, and that's why I have to put something in the middle here, because of course air is what is used for insulation, and so that would cause more heat. And we'll discuss more about heat sinks and cooling and things like that in upcoming nuggets. But the heat sink, by the way, just as long as I'm here, will hook onto this right here, this tab on both sides, and it also requires a pretty good level of exertion at times. They are very, very tight, kind of bent springs that you have to force down over these, and sometimes you might even need to carefully use a screwdriver or other tool to help you push that down, because it's pretty tight. And then here's an example of that clip that goes on to that section that I just told you about. And then here's another look at a cooling solution for your processor. That previous processor that I showed you that would have a heatsink on it was a AMD. You can also get third-party cooling solutions. The most popular one's probably from Thermaltake, and that's what TT is here, Thermaltake. And this one's not a liquid cool design. It just uses a copper heatsink. A heatsink is the device that has fins on it and that dissipates heat away from the processor. It also is going to use a thermal paste or thermal compound of some kind to separate the processor from the heatsink itself and put a good seal there. And then it has a fan on top of it in addition to the cooling fins, so we get pretty good cooling out of this. And for my purposes, this usually works pretty good, but there's some other solutions that you might also see in terms of cooling. Let's take a look at some others. This is more of a server solution, but there are also home PCs, the high-end ones, that have a similar solution to this. And that is where there's a fan here. It's concealed by the green section right here, so you can't see it. But there's a case fan that draws air in from outside, puts it over through this cowling or this ductwork here, and then shoots it down on top of the processor. There's no processor installed on this item right here, but there's a heat sink and processor underneath the heat sink over here. To get a better look at that, I take the cowling off, and I can then see the fan itself. This is the fan that clips to the case that provides that airflow. And then here's the heat sink with the cowling taken off, and that air just comes in from outside of the case because of that fan, shoots down over the top of this heat sink, which you can see is pretty substantial. This thing's probably 6 or 7 inches high. I mean, it's a pretty big heat sink, and it's got copper conductors in there, and copper dissipates heat very well. And then after this, you also have other solutions such as liquid cooling. And then here's an example of a liquid cool system from Thermaltake. Just go to thermaltake.com and it allows you to select whichever continent you're from there. And this is just one of the examples. They have much more elaborate solutions than this, but I thought this would give us a pretty big idea here over what it's going to work with. The big idea here is, and you can see how it installs into the system, it installs a fan over here, and it circulates the liquid throughout these tubes here that go over the processor, and it keeps it extremely cool. It's pretty much the best way to keep a very hot system cool. Now, it's a little bit overkill for some purposes. If you're just a generic home user, for example, and you don't do high-end gaming or dual processing functions or overclocking or any of those kinds of things, this would probably be overkill and would be more of an expense than you would need. But people that like to do a lot of overclocking, which means to apply more power and processing speed to the processor than it was originally designed for, then that causes it to heat up faster and hotter. Then you'll need maybe a solution such as this. And this does not use conventional water or distilled water. It uses a special coolant. It looks like antifreeze, in fact. It's that kind of greenish-looking colored stuff. So it's a lot like a radiator in your car. Oh, also, I mentioned earlier the risk of the power supply falling down while you're trying to install it or you're just dropping it or something. Most of these motherboard cases, you can tip over onto their side, and you're going to probably need to do that anyway when you're installing the motherboard. So this motherboard case right over here, which is a tower case, I would flip over onto its side so that this would be the bottom, and that will, of course, help to alleviate the falling power supply problem. Then here's an example of an external drive bay. I could put a CD-ROM, DVD drive, something like that, or even a sound card that has two separate parts. It might have a card itself that's installed into the expansion slot in the computer, and then a front panel here that allows me to adjust volume and plug in different kind of SPDIF connections and things like this. We'll talk all about multimedia later on, but that's another thing I could kind of put in here. But if I'm putting drives in, many times nowadays what we do is we install rails on the sides of the drives using drive screws. We screw the drive rails on and fasten them, and then they'll have a clip at the end of that drive rail so that as we shove the drive into this opening, there's a clip that attaches to something on the inside here, and then in order to remove that drive, you simply depress the sides of those levers and pull it out again. It pretty much shows itself. If you ever see them, it's not too hard to figure out. As far as the screws that go into the side of the drive, by the way, once again, I've really read some ridiculous stuff. One otherwise well-respected author on A+ information says to not use screws that are too long because you could puncture the housing for the hard drive and enter into the chamber, the sealed chamber of the hard drive platters. That's ridiculous. First of all, if you use a screw that's too long, it just won't go any further. This is a cast metal housing for that hard drive. You and I do not have enough power to twist that screw any harder to be able to get it through there. You'd have to actually drill through it in order to get that far, so that's just kind of ridiculous. But again, you do want to use the right size screw because you don't want to strip out the threads or cause problems with metal shavings or the like. Now here's another example of an installation. This is actually a full-size hard drive, and notice that I got screw holes lined up with these holes right here. I would then, of course, just put a screw inside of each one of those holes to affix this drive in place. This is not usually as good a design. I don't usually like this one as much as the rail design, but it's a different way of going about it. Now with this particular one, I'd also have to move the other side, this other cover, to get to the screw holes on the opposite side of the case. And then if you are installing a CD or DVD-ROM drive, then they're going to have a sound cable that plugs into the back of the drive, and you'll see where this fits. There's a matching location on the opposite end of this that goes into the drive, and then this goes into the motherboard if you have integrated sound on the motherboard, or it will go into a connector on your sound card. This, as you can see here, as a tab and a keying that will only install one way. Now, it's a little bit out of focus, but you can see down here that it identifies this as CD audio, so it marks it pretty well on the case. While I'm here, by the way, there's another example of a fan power connector that we see right here. And then here's the light that I was telling you about. Remember I said that even if you have the power turned off to the computer, there will still be a light. This is one of those lights that will identify that you still actually have live power to the motherboard. And then just here's an unobstructed view with nothing attached, so you can see all these connectors and lights and things a little bit more clearly. But getting back to our drive installation, we'll, of course, put the drive in, as I mentioned a little earlier, and then whether it's a CD, DVD, or a hard drive, if it's an IDE, then you'll, of course, attach an IDE cable here. Now, I'm using round cables. Let me show you an example of what these look like if you see the full view of them. They look like this. Normally, these are going to be flat 80-pin, 80-wire ribbon cables, and they're the same width as this connector right here. They're pretty obstructive, and they block airflow, so I invested in these round ones, which you can usually get now, and most people that buy anything new are going to get the round ones instead because they have better shielding. Notice that there's a shielded braiding that goes all the way around it. Better shielding for electrical interference, as well as the fact that they use less space inside of the case and don't block your airflow. But then regardless, I'll take that connector then and attach it here, and then you have jumpers here on the drive, which we'll discuss later when we talk about drives. So I'll attach that here, then I'll also attach my power here, and when I've done that, you'll see a Molex power connector. This particular power supply has black connectors, so they're a little bit harder to see maybe, but there are 4-pin cable that goes into this connector. And it likewise is keyed in only one way, so you can't install it upside down. And then going back to the IDE cable, the other end of the IDE cable comes from the hard drive or CD or DVD-ROM to one of these IDE connections on the motherboard. Typically, your boot drive you want to attach to IDE 1, which would correspond with this blue connector here. And other things such as CD, DVD-ROMs would attach to a secondary IDE or IDE 2 in this case, and that's for boot purposes. Typically, the system will look for whatever's on IDE 1 to boot first, and usually you want to boot the operating system from a hard drive attached to IDE 1. This, of course, loses relevance if you're using serial ATA connectors and drives. Then you can also set the BIOS to boot from one of those drives instead. Now, earlier we took a look at this photograph where we have various connectors and things in the expansion slots and the like. Notice that this has it's not an expansion card. It doesn't actually fit into a slot. It just uses this cover right here, or rather this expansion slot opening, and it has a cable that goes back around to here to this thing. Well, what in the world could that thing be? Well, if we get a zoomed-in view of where those things connect, these are USB connectors here, and they are keyed in such a way that, again, there's a pin missing here, and there's a blocked pin hole on the connector, which helps you to key this in the correct orientation. So that allows me to get, in this case, extra USB connections on the exterior of the case at the back. Others of these might have connections that you can use to connect to connectors on the case that appear on the front or the top of the case to be more convenient. And then there's also a USB one, or rather a FireWire one as well. And here's an example of the FireWire one that you can see here. Make sure you don't mix up the USB and the FireWire because the power is different on both of those, and you could really scramble something or damage something if you put a USB connector onto this FireWire or vice versa. And then here are the USB and FireWire cables that would connect to those pins that I just showed you. And again, notice that there's a pin missing here, and there's a block here where there would be a pin for the insertion so that you can orient it properly. And then we discussed this earlier, but this is where you put in your panel connectors. You're getting close to the end here now. There's also a game connector here. We don't really use those very often because nowadays most game controllers use USB ports, but that's where you would plug one in if you had one. And then here's an example of a power connector. This is from my power supply onto the power supply connector on the motherboard. It's again also keyed, and it has a locking tab that helps to confirm the proper connection. So that's one of the last things you'll do is to plug in this power. And we discussed power a little bit earlier, but here's where I would put my 20-pin power connector in here. And you can see that this is keyed in such a way by the slot. You see there's kind of rounded corners in some of these. So it can only be plugged in one way because of that, as well as the fact that there's a tab here for keying purposes that will also lock down that power supply connector onto the motherboard. And then here's simply a picture of it actually attached to that same connector. In this nugget, we took a look at motherboard installation, where it really wasn't just the motherboard, but it was also other components. I guess you could say all those other components that eventually attach to the motherboard, because just about everything does. And of course, that included things like expansion cards, video cards of various types, memory, processors. All those kinds of things are what we discussed by using photographs to demonstrate here in this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.